So welcome, everyone. I'm Jenny McGill. I'm the co-director of the Economic and Political Development Concentration, which I think everyone in the audience knows, but for anyone who's joining us online, here at the School of International and Public Affairs, delighted to be welcoming you all and welcoming our speakers on behalf of SIPA, including my concentration and also the Gender and Public Policy Specialization, which is also an important co-sponsor, and the Institute for Global Politics, which has made all the logistical arrangements. We're really thrilled to be able to invite back a couple of our alums, joined by the head of their team at the World Bank Women, Business, and the Law team. And so we've got Taya, Nayantara, and Alex, who will be really sharing with you wonderful insights from the latest, the 2024 edition of the Women, Business, and the Law report. I'd like to put that in a little context. For those of you who track things like gender data, gender-related indexes, this has been an initiative that's been underway since 1995. One of the challenges in addressing gender equality issues is the lack of data. And so starting in 1995, the UNDP added a couple of indexes, gender-related indexes, to its suite of indexes, which had started with the Human Development Index. And over the years since then, different organizations have developed other indexes for particular purposes. And you'll hear today about the Women, Business, and Law Index that's been supported by the World Bank, as well as a number of partners. There are limitations to all these indexes, and this is the way I approach this topic in my own gender politics and development class. Indexes are blends of data, of different data sources. They are typically based on national statistics, and therefore those statistics in themselves mask important variations at the local level that could be based on not just gender and sexuality, but also age, race, ethnicity, caste, class, location, citizenship. But they still have important purposes. And I think it's important for those of us who work in the field to be better educated about these indexes, the way they're constructed, the way they can be used, what their strengths and weaknesses are. And I'd like to highlight that in the full report, the Women, Business, and Law report for 2024, the Women, Business, and Law team has really done a wonderful job of highlighting what they see as the strengths and weaknesses. And I always see that as a good indicator of the quality of data that the people constructing the index or compiling the data really lay out where the data comes from, but also what the pluses and minuses are. And you'll hear more about that from the speakers today. Also, what impresses me about this team and their work is how they've evolved in their own approach. What you're going to be hearing about today are some wonderful additions to the work they have been doing for a number of years. And I see that also as testament to their curiosity and also their desire to make these indexes as useful as possible, as well as the underlying reports. So with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to our wonderful speakers from the World Bank, and thanks so much to them again for trekking all the way from DC to Morningside Heights.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Professor McGill, and thank you all for being here. My thanks also goes out to the Institute for Global Politics for the invitation to speak. It's really wonderful to be here and not a problem at all to come from DC. It's a pleasure. My name is Taya Trumbic, and I'm the manager of the Women, Business, and the Law project at the World Bank. Our project measures how laws and policies impact women's economic opportunities in 190 economies around the world. And today I wanted to start with a story. No, sorry, I need, or someone can put the next slide. I can also tell you the next slide if someone can control it in the back end. Okay, there. All right, good. All right. Apologies. So I wanted to start with this picture. This is a woman in Amman, Jordan, this particular woman, but it could be a woman anywhere. It could be here in New York City, it could be in different countries. It's a woman waiting for a bus and it's getting dark. And maybe you've also experienced this feeling of being afraid of harassment or theft because it's happened to you, it's happened to somebody you know, especially when using public transportation. And this can make you question your job choices, your education choices, the desire to leave the house and go places that you might otherwise want to be. And women are impacted more because of their choices and sometimes their circumstances, where they are placed in dangerous situations, but also they have to go different places. So women have different patterns than men when they travel. They're more likely to use public transport because they don't have access to cars. They're more likely to go to different places when they go to and from work, picking up children or visiting different family members. And they're often waiting in unsafe situations. Unfortunately, public transport is not gender neutral, but most public transport policies treat it that way. 1 in 3 women experience violence in the course of their lifetimes, and this is a problem that we see in every single country and economy around the globe. In 2021, the policymakers in Jordan
Also try that. Come on.
I don't know, it's not working. All right, you figure out. The policymakers in Jordan decided to do something about this, and in fact, they made their public transport policy have a gender component. It was part of their gender action plan, which specifically targeted mobility and safety of women and other populations as well. With things like lower fares, enhanced features like air conditioning and security cameras, and limited capacity to prevent overcrowding, women felt safer during their commutes. And research suggests, one slide. Research suggests that this type of interventions could boost public transportation usage in Amman from 14%, which it is today, to 40% by 2025, in just a couple of years. And this could improve women's economic prospects. But why did I choose to start by telling you this story? Okay, next slide, please. Because women in Jordan might have benefited from a gender-sensitive transportation policy, but women around the world still face numerous challenges that impact their daily lives. Their ability to freely and safely choose where to go and where to work, to access equal opportunities, to enter and remain in the labor market, to manage their time, their careers, and care for their children and families. And the data speak for itself. Globally, 1 in 2 women work compared to 80% of men. And we see a large variation both within and across regions. In South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, only a quarter or less of women work, while nearly 3/4 of the men do. And when women do work, they're more likely to be in informal, vulnerable, and lower paying jobs. And we also see that 1 in 3 businesses are owned by women, and 1 in 4 new companies started last year were women owned. Women have more restrictions in accessing finance and with less favorable terms. And this is why we still see that women do not have equal opportunity in any country around the world. Now, this is one of the reasons that for the last 15 years, the Women Business and the Law team has decided to analyze how laws affect women's lives around the world with one goal: to see how laws or lack thereof affect women's economic opportunities. And one of the reasons that we focused on laws, because those are under the direct control of governments. It's something that they can directly impact through their policies. Our first report was published in 2010, and it covered 128 economies and had data on 6 areas that affect women's labor force participation. And since then, we have expanded both the scope of the project and the geographic coverage to include 190 economies today, and as I'll tell you in a few minutes, 10 different indicators. This index has become a valuable tool for policymakers, for researchers, for academics, and the public at large to understand the legal landscape and how it affects women's economic rights, but also track reforms and progress around the world. We've also used it to highlight important areas that have come to be in the last few years in particular. For example, in 2021, the report also included findings on government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in 2023, the report included an analysis of 53 years of reforms for women's rights to see how rights and outcomes have evolved around the world. Our latest report, released earlier this month, is perhaps one of our most ambitious ones so far. It's the 10th in the series. Next slide, please. And up until last year, the 2023 report measured countries' progress towards gender legal equality through 8 indicators built around a woman's key interaction with the law. Those were mobility, workplace, pay, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pension. And this year, we've added 2 additions. One is on safety and another on childcare, which are 2 issues that are critically important to women's lives and opportunities to work. The safety indicator analyzes laws and policies that protect women from gender-based violence, including issues such as femicide, child marriage, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. And the childcare indicator analyzes the availability, affordability, and quality of childcare services around the world. Several of the other indicators and questions have been refined with new questions added to make them more relevant. And this new legal framework paints a more accurate picture of the challenges and opportunities experienced by women as they go through their lives. Next slide, please. And this year, Women, Business, and the Law has expanded its measurement in several ways, setting a new frontier for measuring legal rights. First, we've expanded the legal index, as I explained, to add these 2 new critical areas. But we also started questioning ourselves, what good are laws on the books? Let's face it, passing a law without implementing is like writing a letter and never mailing it. There was a critical piece of the puzzle missing. And so in addition to measuring laws on the books, we embarked on understanding what type of frameworks, institutions, policies, and budgets, guidelines were needed to fully implement these laws and achieve outcomes. And finally, to get a fuller picture of what women's rights look like in real life, we surveyed our experts in select countries to understand their opinions of the outcomes of the law and see if those are being translated into improvement of women's opportunities. Do women have freedom of movement, equal pay? Do they have equal rights as men in practice? Next slide. And what we found was that the legal gender gap is in fact much wider than we previously thought. While we have been reporting that women have only 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men, when we factor in gaps identified in critical areas such as safety and childcare, we find now that in reality, women have only 2/3 of the legal rights of men. I will now hand it over to my colleague Nayantara, a SIPA alum, to take you through the main findings of the Women, Business, and the Law 2024 report.
Thank you, Jaya, and thank you to SIPA and IGP for having me back here. It's good to be back. So as Jaya mentioned, and now we have the clicker working, so that's great. As Jaya mentioned, women around the world have just 2/3 of the legal rights afforded to men. This means that 3.9 billion women worldwide still face legal barriers affecting their economic participation. Let's have a closer look at the findings from this year's report. When looking at the average scores for each of the 10 indicators that Jaya just took you through, we find that the new indicators are amongst the lowest scoring ones. The weakness is greatest in women's safety. The global average score is just 36 out of 100, meaning women enjoy barely 1/3 of the legal protections they need from domestic violence, sexual harassment, child marriage, and femicide. Although 151 economies have laws in place prohibiting sexual harassment in the workplace, just 39 have laws prohibiting it in public spaces. Women do then face perils in using public transportation to travel to work. Overall, 139 economies lack adequate legislation prohibiting child marriage, which typically suppresses a girl's future educational and economic opportunities. Most economies also score poorly on laws pertaining to childcare. Women spend on average 2.4 hours a day more on unpaid care work than men, much of it involving children. Expanding access to children tends to increase women's participation in the labor force by about 1 percentage point initially, with the effect doubling within 5 years. Only 62 economies, that's fewer than 1/3, have established quality standards governing childcare services. As a result, in 128 economies, women may think twice about going to work while they have children in their care. Oops. Next slide, please. Clicker has a mind of its own today. In this year's report, we find that not one economy has achieved legal equality under the new index. The scores vary among the regions and follow a similar pattern as previous years. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, high-income economies have the highest scores, and 11 of these economies score over 90 on the index. The lowest regional average scores are observed in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa regions, and the range of scores is greatest in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa region. This highlights the strong need for reforms, but also the potential for countries to learn from their neighbors in the region. Next slide, please. Oh, I got it. And while change is never easy, if there is one thing we do know, it's that change is possible. 18 countries in all regions but South Asia made progress towards legal gender equality by enacting reforms captured by the Women, Business and the Law 1.0 Index. These economies represent a variety of income levels. In all, they enacted 47 reforms to increase gender equality under the law. Overall, the economies that improved the most were Sierra Leone, Togo, Jordan, Uzbekistan, and Malaysia, thanks to comprehensive reforms in multiple areas, which raised their scores between 10 to 20 percentage points from the previous year. But what about implementation? What we discovered is that almost all economies, even those with the most gender equal laws, face a substantive implementation gap. Only 40% of the supportive frameworks are in place to implement laws measured by women, business, and the law. Remember the story Tia just told us at the beginning? Jordan is one of the only 27 economies that has a policy in place that explicitly consider the specific mobility needs of women in public transportation. Supportive frameworks for most indicators are lagging, especially those supporting the implementation of laws related to the workplace and assets indicators. For example, under the workplace indicator, while 162 economies have laws that prohibit discrimination in employment, only 76 economies have a specialized body that receives complaints of such discrimination in the workplace. And only 44 economies in the government have published guidelines by the government on non-discrimination in recruitment. But while other indicators appear to be relatively advanced in terms of supportive frameworks, this shouldn't be taken as good news. For example, the average entrepreneurship supportive framework score is just 39.6, clearly indicating shortcomings in the availability of supportive frameworks for female entrepreneurs. This score suggests that only about 40% of the supportive frameworks measured are currently in place to ensure the advancement of gender equality in entrepreneurship. This year, we also asked experts not only about the law, but also about their opinions on how the laws measured under the Women, Business and Law Index, or the absence of these laws, function in practice. Across the sample of 164 economies, the expert opinion score on average is 65.7 out of 100. The perception-based assessment sheds light on the areas in which women's rights are most lacking in practice and where women's access to economic opportunities is still limited. We asked about their perception on women's rights in real life. The majority of the surveyed experts believe that compared with men, at least half of the women in their economies enjoy the same freedom of movement, access to paid leave after the birth of a child, equal access to credit, equal rights to immovable property, and equal pension benefits after retirement. However, perceptions on gender-based violence and childcare provisions were strikingly different. More than half of the experts, that's about 55%, indicated that almost no women or only some women are free from gender-based violence. About half of the experts indicated that almost no women or only some women have access to affordable, quality childcare services. This highlights the fact that something has to be done about these two critical issues. The Women, Business and the Law report offers some solutions. I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Alexis. She's going to talk to you a little bit about how we produced the report and take you a little behind the scenes. I hope this works for you.
Yes, and now you can help me, okay? All right, hello, everyone. In an era of persistently slow growth, increasing the participation of women in the global workforce could significantly brighten the outlook. Our research finds that equal treatment of women under the law in the areas that WBL measures is associated with larger numbers of women entering and remaining in the labor force and rising to managerial positions. It also generates higher wages for women and facilitates more women owning a business. Additional research suggests that in OECD countries alone, governments could add $7 trillion to the global economy by closing the gender gap in the labor force and in management. The results coming out of our 2024 report call for a comprehensive set of actions to close these gender gaps. Researchers, such as you, policymakers, the private sector, and civil society can use WBL data to identify and remove barriers to women's economic empowerment, boosting labor force participation and entrepreneurship in the process. In fact, they already have. This slide shows examples of how WBL data have been used and how we measure our impact. For example, over 300 academic papers cited WBL 2023 last year, and this included a working paper by the Nobel Prize-winning economist, Dr. Claudia Goldin. WBL data, as you can see on this slide, are also used to track progress towards SDG Indicator 5.1.1, which measures whether or not legal frameworks are in place to promote, enforce, and monitor equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex. World Bank Group operational colleagues, so our colleagues, also use WBL data in designing development policy operations, which are projects aimed at driving policy and institutional reforms to achieve certain development results. In part, due to these projects, WBL has recorded over 630 positive legal reforms between 2010, a year after a report and project started, to 2023. And just recently, WBL or World Bank colleagues provided advisory support in Togo and Sierra Leone, which facilitated legal reforms captured in our 2024 report. So let's look at the example of Sierra Leone. Starting in 2021, a World Bank Group advisory team supported the government of Sierra Leone's efforts to improve women's access to employment. They did this through a development policy operation, or DPO, as part of an overall aim to boost economic recovery post-pandemic. It was called, as you can see on the slide, the Sierra Leone First Inclusive and Sustainable Growth DPO. Drawing on WBL data, the advisory team provided in-depth diagnostics of legal constraints to women's economic empowerment, evidence on the positive impacts of reforms, and inputs also on drafting the laws and amendments in support of the reform process. Based on this assistance, the government of Sierra Leone submitted a bill to Parliament to amend its existing labor law with the aim of increasing women's labor force participation. The reforms aligned with gaps that the WBL index had already identified. Then, in May 2023, Sierra Leone enacted the New Employment Act, which closed many of these gaps by several measures. It allowed for equal remuneration for work of equal value, paid maternity and paternity leave, prohibited discrimination in employment based on gender, protected pregnant workers from discrimination, lifted restrictions against women from working in certain sectors, and prohibited sexual harassment at work. As a result, Sierra Leone's score on the WBL Legal Index increased 20 points between report years 2023 and 2024. Okay, so now that we have an overall sense of the findings of the 2024 report, let's pull the curtain back and look behind the scenes into the overall report creation cycle. So, to construct and release our index each year, WBL undergoes a cyclical approach, which you can see on this slide. We start the process with survey design by consulting with gender experts and World Bank Group colleagues about our methodology and index questions. We then develop questionnaires on labor and employment law, childcare provisions, family law, and laws protecting women's safety. Next, we send the surveys to our network of legal experts in 190 economies. After we receive the questions back, we verify the relevant law and regulations by doing desk research, and we update the data with any recent reforms. We call this process coding. We then analyze the data, building evidence of the critical relationship between legal gender equality and women's economic outcomes. This analysis allows us to draft our annual report. Before the report is published, we undergo a process called bank-wide review, which is releasing the updated data set and report to World Bank colleagues who provide feedback on the methodology and the content of the report. Afterwards, the report is published to the public and disseminated through a series of events, such as our annual launch event, which just occurred, as well as events at the Commission of the Status of Women and events like today. So we hope that you will also dive into our process workshop afterwards and join us at 2:30 to build more of this understanding of the methodology behind the scenes. All right, so before transitioning to the section where Nayantara and I open up and about the connections between SIPA and our time on WBL, I would like to take a moment to recognize, I guess it's not here. It's okay. We went to the beginning. I went to the beginning. That's okay. We missed the best part, which was photos of our contributors. So good, you get a refresh and can relearn everything we just said. There'll be a test after. Just kidding. Okay, this was the image. So I would like to take a moment to recognize our over 2,400 contributors who completed our surveys for the 2024 report, and without whom we could not publish this report. The contributors are absolutely essential to our process because they respond to our surveys, helping us to update our data and provide us with local context. And to maintain an active contributor base, our team actively recruits new legal and policy experts around the world. You can see from the quotes here that the contributors are very dedicated to advancing gender equality, and they provide the reasons in these slides about why they've contributed to the WBL report. And you too can get involved in advancing gender equality with WBL by sharing the report. You have the executive summary in the back, and also using the data in your research. In fact, already a SIPA team, a capstone project, has used WBL data to understand gender and corporate accountability in Uzbekistan. So that's fantastic. And you can also get involved by responding to our surveys. So if you scan the QR code on the left, this would lead you to a forum to sign up to contribute to our report. And we invite you to contribute if you have legal or policy background and a knowledge about laws in your countries that are related to labor law, family law, laws protecting women from violence, and childcare provisions. On the right, we also invite you to download our report. And this concludes the portion of our discussion on the WBL 2024 report. Thank you so much for listening. And now Nayantara and I will have a less formal discussion to discuss some of the connections between our time at SIPA and our journey to WBL. All right. So Nayantara, I have been talking a lot Do you perhaps want to start?
Is this on? Yeah, it is. I think Professors Jenny and Yasmin asked us to talk a little bit about our journey from here to the World Bank. And I actually used to practice law in India before I came here. And I kid you not when I say that I barely knew how to use Excel when I joined SIPA. Like I could barely put filters on a table. But I ended up graduating in the data analytics specialization, the DAQA as we used to call it. Is that what it's still called? Okay. And now I think, I have a job which involves a lot of data. So I do owe a lot of these skills that I picked up over the years at SIPA. And a lot of these things are really essential to transition from the kind of work that I used to do to working in an international organization. And of course, you get access to a lot of ideas and people with a lot of great ideas, and you learn a lot about a lot of different parts of the world. You have some great professors that are always available to talk. Another thing that I think SIPA gives us is access. I think if before I came to SIPA, if I wrote to a lot of people, they probably wouldn't have replied, but people kind of take the brand a little seriously. So I was able to like get into some of those doors. I actually read the World Bank report for the first time for an assignment that I was doing for Professor Jenny's class. So that kind of worked out. And I think, Alexis also started as an intern with an internship she found on SIPA Link. So I think I'm happy to answer any specific questions you have, but my time at SIPA was, even though it was halfway through my program that the pandemic started, so I kind of got robbed of a little bit of the physical space. So I'm happy to be back here, to reclaim some of my time in the building. Maybe Alexis, you can talk a little bit.
Oh, sure.
Oh, you have your mic.
Oh, I do have it. We like sharing. Okay, so I did a double degree between Sciences Po and SIPA. And before SIPA, I had worked as a paralegal at the US Department of Justice, and then transitioned to a communications role within the Education Directorate of the OECD. And what I really like about the WBL team is, as you can see, there are many elements involved in the annual production cycle. So you're able to wear many different hats, whether it's legal research related, communications related, as Nayantara mentioned, data analysis focused. And so I've really appreciated using that versatility. And I would say too that the SIPA program itself, it was one of the most interdisciplinary programs I could find. There are so many different specializations and concentrations. And I think the beauty of it is that you're able to really cater it to your interests and the areas that you're trying to develop further. And I would say that that ability to learn new topics and be able to transition between different topics is directly applicable to the work we do on WBL, because we're constantly learning new areas, trying to understand how to create an indicator, which you'll learn later in the workshop. So please come at 2:30. And so it's been really helpful to learn how to really forge a path that you might not know and think on your feet. I would also say that the people at SIPA are invaluable. And as you could see on the slide, our contributors are really the lifeblood of our report. And one of we were hoping to gather surveys from individuals in the island state of Palau, and we were having trouble finding experts in labor law on that island state. But lo and behold, one of my classmates from SIPA and the double degree was from Palau. And so he didn't fill out the survey, but he knew gender experts who then were willing to fill out the survey. And so really that speaks to the power of community and networks as well. And then to echo Nayantara, I would say the first element, or the the third piece of advice is really taking advantage of the data courses here. So my favorite class was with Professor Harold Stolper. It's the econometrics or quantitative analysis 2. And I was new to data analysis and econometrics, but he made it very accessible and very interesting. And again, having the bravery to learn new topics and forge ahead, even if you haven't been exposed to that before, really bodes you well when you're navigating new intellectual terrain on the WBL team as well. So we, all 3 of us and 5 of us actually, are available for questions, whether about the report or about our professional journeys. And so thank you very much for attending, and we welcome your questions. Feel free to just write. I think we have extras. We have extras, so feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, thank you. I was looking through the report and I noticed that a lot of the Muslim majority countries have higher expert scores than I believe the framework. And I was wondering why there's that trend. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone?
Take a few questions.
Yeah, let's take a few at a time and then.
Thank you so much for sharing the report and experience. My question is actually on, I think this year you guys include the expert opinions. And I was wondering, could you dive into a little deep, like how do you code that information as is, it feels more like qualitative, but how do you make that mesh with the quantitative data you have? Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe one more and
I
won't remember.
Thank you. So I won't be able to attend the workshop. I would love to, but I have class. So if you could, I know it's a bit of a detail, but if you could go into like a broad procedure of how you select the index, like how do you come up with the questions? If there's like a framework that you follow, that'll be great.
Okay, so I can start with the expert opinion and Nayantara and Alexis fill in if I forget anything. So this was really something we've been piloting and we haven't quite gotten right yet. So it's a work in progress, but we did want to use, our experts are very generous with their expertise and their understanding of how things look in the country. And so we wanted to understand their perspectives. So these are perception-based questions and they don't exactly follow our legal questions. So whereas the legal questions are very specific on, are women allowed to work legally in these areas or very specific questions in the law, the expert opinions really asked very broad questions. In general, are women free of violence? Are women facing violence in the country? Do they have equal access to certain opportunities? And we did find some interesting results. On average, when we looked at the legal questions and the expert opinions, there's a positive association. So most of the time they go in the same direction, but there were a few outliers. And we don't exactly know why, but we're trying to understand. Part of it is, we know from research that sometimes when, for example, domestic violence law is passed, more cases come up, and then the perception of the community is that now there's more violence all of a sudden, because all of a sudden they're hearing about it more. Whereas when there was no law, they didn't maybe know about it unless they personally experienced it. So that's one hypothesis we have, is that maybe when some of these issues are not even legislated or these rights are not really recognized, they're not seen as an issue because you're not hearing about them. But we haven't fully tested that hypothesis, and we're working for next year on trying to understand how to match the questions better to the expertise of our contributors, because they're lawyers and maybe they, are not the experts on whether women actually have access to property in that country. They can just see from what they observe through their work. So we're trying to think of how to match the expertise of our respondents currently to the question, but also how to diversify the respondents we have. And so we're piloting a general poll to understand the views of the general population and not just the legal experts. And we're also looking at subnational variation, both in laws, frameworks, and opinions. So hopefully in our next report, we'll have a lot more knowledge to add to that. But it was interesting, and that finding is very valid still. And the question about how we actually collected this, so we used the same questionnaires where we asked them about the laws and the frameworks where they, for those, had to provide also a basis. So they had to say this is found in the labor law, or this is not found in any law, or they had to kind of tell us the source. Whereas for the opinions, it was just based on their opinion. They didn't have to justify it or validate it in any way. And we didn't, we just reported it as it is. The one thing we did is we had a threshold for including those answers. We had to get at least 5 answers per country per question. And that's why we weren't able to report it for 190 economies. We had enough data for 164. But this was really to allow for some averaging of outliers. And we have all the data on our website, so you can actually see the individual respondents per country and what they responded. It's anonymized to protect their identity, but you can see sort of that in some countries, there's a lot of agreement, and others, maybe there's vast differences. And that's another issue that we're trying to uncover and understand why. I think maybe you want to take the question on the data.
Sure. I'd also add for the expert opinion section. So the questions I ask, the answers, there are 5 different answers. So 0 would be almost no women, for example, benefit from equal remuneration for work of equal value. That would be one option, all the way to the number 4, which is almost all women. And so then we use this scoring methodology and then are able to aggregate those answers, and those contribute to the scoring at the question level, the indicator level, and then ultimately the economy level. But yes, we can definitely look into that more. And then thank you very much for asking the question about developing an indicator, because that is next. So stay tuned at 2:30. So essentially the first overall element when thinking about if we want to develop a new indicator is understanding if that area, if existing research, economic research exists that finds a link between that area of research and women's increased labor force participation. So all of our indicators are grounded in that thorough research. And then for the process overall, as you can imagine, it involves interviewing and doing a literature review, speaking with experts, piloting questions, piloting the scoring methodology, and distributing the surveys, gathering data, and then really iterating and adjusting. And so I think the key takeaway too is that these processes are cyclical and not linear, and that they take many years sometimes to develop. And we're always, open to and grateful for feedback that can see some of the limitations of indicators as well. Nayantara, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, and another thing that WBL does, which is a little unique, is that we follow the life cycle. So we kind of like to think about the life of a woman and what barriers she may face at different phases, which is why it's divided in mobility, pay, workplace, marriage, childcare, and all the way to pension. So it kind of, we try to think of it that way and try to fit it into different phases of a woman's life. And that is why we realized that we had parenthood, which talked about maternity leave and paternity leave and stuff like that. But another thing that was missing was childcare, which is why, as you saw, we added that phase of a woman's life. What after she gives birth to a child? How does she get back to work after that? And then we added safety, which is frankly something that a woman deals with throughout her life. So that's one way of kind of segregating them and thinking about how to group all these different kind of laws and issues that a woman might face.
I think you're your mic.
So first of all, thank you so much for this. And I think it's such really important work. I have 2 questions. One is about healthcare and access to healthcare. And it seems to me that, that could be an important sector to look at and the factors that affect whether women actually do have equal access, for example, rules about accompaniment by a male relative when a woman is being treated by a male doctor, and so on and so forth. And I think it's especially salient in my mind because I'm thinking about the maternal mortality statistics, which are just so bad and rising, including very dramatically in this country, and therefore an important issue. So that's just a sectoral question. More generally, I wonder if you could talk more about how you look at the relationship between the law and its implementation, and how do you analyze that gap?
And maybe I'll add one as well. I was interested in looking at your data notes. The persona, the persona of a woman that you use for comparability to compare data across countries. It's based on an assumption that the woman resides in the main city of the country, is a lawful citizen, is cisgender, same religion as her husband, works in a food retail sector, so has a formal sector job, but low income. It suggested to me that, and I completely understand why for methodological reasons you need that, but it would suggest that it injects certain biases, the urban bias and also a formal sector bias that we know is present in many of the other indexes. I'm thinking of the World Economic Forum, Global Gender Gap Index. But I wondered if this new process of asking for expert opinions might help to balance that, if you could actually be asking not just for legal expertise, because most women lawyers in countries reside in cities, and they may themselves not really appreciate the reality for women in rural areas, just as an example. So perhaps reaching out beyond lawyers, perhaps some anthropologists, some sociologists, people who work in in some other sectors or other areas of the country, who could speak to what the reality is beyond the persona that you need to use for purposes of your methodology.
I can ask you next.
Or you want to answer?
Questions, I just wanted to add.
All right, I think yes and yes and yes is my answer. We recognize that those are both all valid issues, and we are doing some research actually on sexual health and reproductive rights. That's how we start. We start with sort of questions from different experts we consult with that sort of spark the need for something. We've come a long way in the 15 years from sort of looking more at purely economic issues in the workplace to actually moving to the household, to issues that kind of are in the community, and are starting to think how to include more areas. But we do run into practical challenges, and some of those are being able to collect this information. So legal experts are easier, they're not easy, but they usually have a computer, they're used to documents, it's easy for them to look up a law. Doing a more general population survey, we are attempting that exactly to see what we can get from a more diverse group, and we're doing it through the Gallup World Poll, which will be representative at the national level in all different, men, women, rural areas, different employment statuses, to see what we can get from that group, and that would be really interesting. But those are extremely expensive surveys that take a long time and that we don't have the ability to do ourselves. So we'd have to subcontract someone like Gallup or other survey teams that can go face to face. So we do most of our data collection through online self-administered surveys. And for that, you do need a certain background. But we are asking those questions as well. And we're looking at others that might be producing this data that we can associate our findings with. And I have to say, we do base all of our data and research on evidence coming out of research, and then we hope that what we produce also feeds into other research that can point to new areas. And so we are open to expanding the index, but we have certain limitations in our resources as well, and the ability to compare countries equally. So when it comes to implementation, for example, it's something that we've always known is important, but we just didn't even know how to start measuring it. And so what we thought is we'd start with the legal basis, which can be maybe more comparable if we ground it in some of these assumptions. And then others, from different organizations can do deep dives and really understand implementation, where you might not have you might have to, by design, not have a comparable methodology, but might need to understand the context of the country. And so we were hoping that this would be coupled with impact evaluations of particular reforms, and that has happened. So the World Bank teams that have used the data to help governments reform then have done also these type of studies to understand what are the implementation challenges. And through our research, we tried to understand how reform happens to see how we can inspire more of it. And one thing that came clear was that implementation's a challenge, even once reforms are passed, but the work of civil society is extremely important to drive that change. Awareness campaigns and not just sort of stopping at one point is a problem. Budgets are important. And so we tried now with our supportive frameworks, which doesn't quite get to implementation. We try to outline some frameworks that we've seen work to get the law implemented in a better way. So having budgets, having statistics on women's participation in different areas so that you can see what your baseline is and track its progress, having policies that and guidelines for the private sector and citizens on how to access their rights. Those are the type of things we're starting to track to sort of understand if that can get us closer to measuring implementation in the country, but we're still not quite analyzing the full implementation of these laws ourselves.
Oh, hi, I have a question, because I was looking at the findings and then I find that the scores from the 1.0 to 2.0, most of the countries has a drop in scores. So I was wondering why is that? And then one of the reasons might be because we added some of the indexes. So a follow-up question will be, how do we interpret this if we like have some edits every year, and then what's the how's that affect the comparability across different years? And should we just look at 1 year and then, yeah, just like in general, how should we interpret the changes? Thank you.
Is that?
Oh, yeah. Sure.
This was very related to Jenny's question to you, but more from a data perspective. So if you're looking at women who are specifically married and in, in the major economy, in the major city of that particular economy, in some countries, some developing countries specifically, the representative population is mostly rural, right? Like in India, for example, 64% of the population is rural. So what would you say about the generalizability of the score that you have on hand for researchers, in sense of like, if you say that India has a WBL score of, I think, 53 or whatever it might be, in my opinion, that could be an overestimate even in comparison to what the actual legal rights might be for 64% of the people that are not represented in the data collected. And I understand you have explained the reasons why this occurs, and that's completely understandable. But I was wondering if with the Gallup surveys, this might be ameliorated. And I think my second question was to do with the expert opinion surveys. So when you see the way that the questions are asked, it's, as you said, it's very subjective. Do you think how many women do you think are facing gender-based violence? And there's a Likert scale. And there can be a cultural component to how people view gender-based violence. And, for example, again, I'm Indian, so I'm going to stick to the Indian context here. Marital rape is not considered a crime. It's not considered violence in any particular form, but I think we can all agree that it is violent. So how would you account for the cultural specificities of these responses when you're measuring them? And I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Could I follow up?
On that question about the rural, sorry, but I wonder whether it wouldn't be possible to somehow develop a coefficient, a sort of rural-urban coefficient that would have to be country specific or something, but that would enable you not to give a accurate, as detailed, but some sense. And that wouldn't necessarily assume that urban women are always better off, but would allow for some adjustments. Just a thought.
I can take the question about the scores from 1.0 to 2.0. So we added two indicators, and as we saw, those two indicators turned out to be very low scoring ones, meaning that there aren't a lot of protections or provisions for women for safety and childcare. But then for some of the questions, we also had methodology changes and we increased sort of the threshold that economies had to meet to be able to get that score. So, for example, in our domestic violence question, which earlier used to be under the marriage indicator and now is under the safety indicator, we added the requirement that marital rape be recognized under the law. So, a lot of economies that may have a general domestic violence law, but have a law that exempts men from or husbands from being prosecuted for raping their wives now don't get that score for the question of domestic violence. So we did increase that threshold, and that is the reason that you're seeing some of the scores drop as well. In terms of comparability, I think because this was a transition year, that is the reason we decided to keep both the 1.0 and 2.0 index. For the 1.0 scores, we do already have a large panel data, which has about 50 or 55 years of data, where we kind of back calculate. It's a little easier to do for legal frameworks because you know exactly when a law came into force. So we are able to create that panel data, and hopefully in the coming reports, we'll be able to recreate that panel data also for, at least for the legal frameworks for the 2.0 index, and that will allow for researchers to compare and back calculate and sort of see the progress over time. But yeah, the main reason is that we just increased the threshold and increased our standards and said that we need to do more and better laws are needed, and that's why the scores dropped.
So I'll address Purika's question then. And so I think it's true that probably some of the scores are overestimating the situation of women in the country. And I like the idea of thinking about different ways to weight that. We can certainly look into that. We are thinking about, we don't want to change too many things too often. So we had a big change 5 years ago with the 2020 report that introduced the index. Now it's been 5 years, we had this change. We don't necessarily want to keep changing every year for comparability reasons, and to also be able to track countries who are reforming in the areas we're measuring before we change them again. But we are thinking about looking at our scoring methodology, especially now that we've added these nuances that are maybe not visible because we still have a binary score of yes and no, but you don't know why the country gets a no, which component it's missing. So thinking about partial credits and some way of adding more nuance. But we are also thinking about developing this subnational women business and the law product, which could be done in countries, large federal states like India, the US, Brazil, ones that really, there'll be a large variation depending on where you are, not just business, not just rural, urban, but also different states within a country, to see, you know, how laws vary, how frameworks vary, and also how the outcomes vary as well. So we're piloting that this year in a couple of countries, and hopefully this is a product that we can offer in addition to complement the Women Business and the Law Index.
I just want to wrap this up. I want to thank you all so much for trekking up here. It's an incredible privilege for us to have the three of you. T, thank you for coming, Nayantara and Alexis. It's so nice to have you back, I have to say. And thank you, Jenny. Thank you to IGP also for so much for helping us to organize this. I think our temptation is to want the Women Business and the Law reports to be sort of something like the report on the state of women in the world. There's another one like that. But this one has the kind of structural continuity, and it's really important and foundational for the kind of work that we do. And I think that what we've seen with your enlargement of scope, so to speak, and especially with the addition of the two new indicators, is the confirmation of something that we all know, which is that you can't take an economistic lens to the question of women's conditions in society and women's life chances. And that it's only when you start to consider the interaction between legal frameworks in areas that are directly related to economic participation, but that are also closely expressive of other social factors, such as the question about childcare, such as the question about violence and security, and actually so many of the other indicators that you use, that you can start to get even an understanding of the question of women's participation in the economy. Which leads me to another point, which is, you know, you made the point very clearly, all of you, and it's a point that's been made now for at least a decade, which is better women's involvement in the formal economy would be an extraordinary boon to all economies, starting from advanced economies. And so the question that we have to ask is, so why hasn't this happened? Is it just a mistake? I mean, really? Have policymakers just been silly or blind? And obviously the answer is no, that's not why. The answer is in the kinds of indicators that you have brought in and that you look at. It's in the structural factors that affect the relative positions of women and men in any particular society. And so when we think of the transformative processes, and I just want to say one word on implementation, that need to occur, it's also not that the implementation gap is completely coincidental. All of this leads me to ask the question, when do we explicitly talk about power? And when do we explicitly address the question of negotiation? And I think, without having to answer that question, which I myself cannot answer, but I think that part of what is happening here and happens thanks to you is that the production of knowledge, as somebody said a long time ago, knowledge is power. And that this kind of production of knowledge and the networks that it feeds into and that it depends on and helps to feed is actually essential to the work that we do here, to the work that our students will go on to do, but also in general to the work of the transformation of women's status, so that when we add new indicators in the future, we don't see a regression, but a progression. We might get to the point where by broadening the scope, things look better rather than harder. So thank you so much. And I really look forward to the skills workshop.